2 tons of firewood, 380 pounds of smoked meat, 48 gallons of water, 4 months of preparation, all gone in just 11 minutes. On a gray November morning, I stood there. What I thought was my shield against the cruel Montana winter was now a pile of ash and twisted metal. The HOA security team left exactly 45 minutes ago. I know because my camera caught everything. The camera they thought was broken. Comment below where you are watching from, because what I'm about to say will make your blood boil. My name is Ethan Ramirez. 3 days ago, for the first time in 15 years, I took my grandfather's old Mossberg 500 off the wall, loaded it, and walked straight into the HOA meeting. What happened next, no one in Cedar Crest will ever forget. But before that, I have to take you back 72 hours, when I still believed following rules meant something. I came to Cedar Crest 3 years ago after my second deployment in Afghanistan, when the VA finally cleared me for civilian life. Montana felt like the right place, where people need silence more than talk and find peace in the weight of an axe rather than the noise of a crowded bar. My home was at the end of Pine Road, a small 2-bedroom cabin, a wraparound porch, and a mountain view that made every sunrise a blessing. I chose this place for the promise of peace. I didn't know then that Cedar Crest's peace had conditions, and those conditions were set by a man who thought he was more than just his title. Building my stockpile took 4 months. Since July, every weekend I drove my truck 38 miles to McPherson Farm, loading dry oak and pine until I had blisters through my gloves. The meat came from a hunt on September 5th, elk processed by my own hands, slowly smoked over apple wood. 48 gallons of water were stored in food-grade barrels against the back wall of the shed. In my first winter here, I learned what happens without preparation. A 9-day blackout, nearly losing 3 fingers to frostbite, cold so bad people bargained with God. That shed wasn't for comfort. It was insurance against silent death in the night. And someone decided it was inconvenient. The violation notice arrived Tuesday morning, shoved in the mailbox like a hiding snake. The bright orange header stuck out in the afternoon light, making the words blur. Unauthorized structure, visual obstruction, failure to maintain aesthetic standards. They claimed my storage shed violated Section 15.3 about height ratios, which no one had mentioned in 3 years. There was a photo circled in red marker like evidence at a crime scene. Signed at the bottom, Martin Crow, President, Cedar Crest Homeowners Association. Fine, $475 a day, effective immediately. 3 years of silence, and suddenly I was a problem. The next morning I went to the HOA office, a low brick building in the center of the community, tinted windows, an American flag hanging in the windless sky. Inside smelled of fake lavender and felt too clean. The woman behind the desk smiled a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Mr. Ramirez," she said before I introduced myself. "Mr. Crow is expecting you." I hadn't called ahead. I didn't have an appointment. Yet Martin Crow knew I was coming. The hair on my neck stood up. His office took up the whole back area. Dark wood, leather furniture, framed certificates announcing dedication to community excellence. Martin Crow stood up as I entered, extending a hand, soft, moisturized, the hand of a man who never worked outside. Age 59, silver hair, the confidence of someone used to being obeyed. "Ethan," he said, like an old friend. "Sit." I remained standing. "The shed has been there for 2 years. Same height, same spot. No one said anything until now." His smile flickered for a moment, not surprised but recognizing, the look of a hunter spotting prey. "Rules change," he said calmly. "What was acceptable yesterday might not be in our best interest today." He straightened a pen that was already perfectly straight. "When someone becomes a problem," he said, not looking away, "it affects everyone. The problem wasn't the shed, it was me." "I am calling this a violation," he added softly, leaning back in his chair. "And in this community, violations have consequences. Here, HOA guidelines are the law." He paused, letting the words drop like stones. "And I enforce that law." I left the office with my fists clenched so hard my fingers hurt. That evening, I knocked on the door of my neighbor, Mrs. Nora Heller, 77 years old, retired school teacher, the oldest resident in Cedar Crest. The look she gave me when she opened the door froze me. Pure fear. "I can't," she whispered, looking toward the street. "Last spring, they took my rose garden. Fines, then a lien. I almost lost my house." Her hand trembled on the doorframe. "Martin's people are everywhere. Police, county clerk, you can't win." She was about to close the door, then stopped. "No one ever has." The door closed. I stood alone, realizing what kind of war I had stepped into. That night, I sat in the living room with the lights off, looking at the shape hanging above the fireplace. Granddad's Mossberg 500. It had been there since the day I arrived. I never fired it, never took it down. It was a symbol of values. Protect your space. Don't bow to bullies. Next to it, the red light of the old security camera, the one I told them was broken during last year's inspection when the HOA wanted everyone's footage. The camera had been recording ever since, every car, every person. Seeing that red light in the dark, I realized it might be my most important asset. I took out my military notebook, the one I had in Kandahar, full of routes and threat assessments. On a new page, I wrote 2 words, Martin Crow. Below that, I started a list. The timing of the notice, his foreknowledge, his micro-expressions, Nora's terror, the connections she mentioned. I didn't know then that I wasn't making a list. I was building a case. And 72 hours later, when I would stand in the ashes, this notebook would save me from making a decision that couldn't be undone. The final notice came 48 hours later, not by mail, but by hand. 3 knocks on the door at 6:10 a.m. By the time I got there, the guy was gone. The envelope was heavier than the last one, official seal shiny. Inside were 11 pages of dense legal language. The title was clear, Final Non-Compliance. The shed had to be moved within 48 hours, or the association would take immediate corrective action at the owner's expense. A threat in clear words. The morning was spent calling lawyers. 2 didn't call back. The 3rd listened for 85 seconds and stopped me. Cedar Crest? Martin Crow? Pause. Sorry, conflict of interest. His reach went far in this small county. Everyone said the same thing. Pay the fine, tear down the shed, move on. They didn't understand. Moving on wasn't in my dictionary. That evening, I checked the online community group. My stomach turned. Without using my name, there were dozens of posts about me. The veteran at the end of Pine Road, the guy with the stockpile. A thread called Concerns About Unstable Neighbor had over 200 comments. Some said I threatened them. Someone said something needs to be done before he snaps. People whose packages I held, people who waved at me, they were making me into a monster. That same evening, security patrols started. White SUVs circling every half hour. At midnight, one parked across the street, headlights off. In Afghanistan, we called this softening the target. Martin knew warfare well. That next night, Nora came through the shadows. She didn't come inside. She whispered, Sunrise Holdings belongs to Martin's brother-in-law. They pressure people with violations, then buy low. 11 houses in 5 years. Complaints disappear. She vanished into the dark. I knew this wasn't just Martin. It was a system. The next evening, I went to the HOA meeting. They silenced me because I hadn't registered. 50 people watched. 50 people knew I tried. Driving home, my head went into operational mode. Tomorrow, I'd go to the county. I'll ask for receipts. I'll ask for records. Patience is my weapon. At dawn, I woke up to a smell. Smoke, chemicals. I ran outside. The shed was burning. Too fast, too hot. 2 men in security uniforms stood watching. They smiled. They left. I called 911. Controlled burn, they said. The fire truck came 45 minutes later. By then, everything was ash. At dawn, I stood in the ashes and filmed. November 16th, 6:49 a.m. The camera caught the truth. At 3:22 a.m., 2 men, security logos on their jackets, red cans, pouring, fire, 4 minutes. Not an accident, arson. I knew this wasn't the end. I didn't bother going back to sleep. Once the fire crews left and the last curls of smoke thinned into the pale Montana sky, my body stayed wired, every nerve tuned tight. I showered, dressed, and packed my laptop with the same methodical calm I used before dawn patrols years ago. Panic wastes time. Order creates options. I drove 31 miles to the county seat just after sunrise, the road empty, frost still clinging to the ditches. The sheriff's office sat beside the courthouse, a low concrete building with flags snapping in the cold. I asked for a deputy and waited without pacing. When Deputy Laura Mendel stepped out, her eyes sharp and assessing, I handed her a thumb drive without a word. We sat in a small interview room while the footage played in silence. 2 men in Cedar Crest security jackets, a red fuel container, a match, 4 minutes. Laura paused the video at a frame where moonlight caught a cheekbone. She leaned closer, then exhaled slowly. "That's Kyle Brunner," she said. "Battery charge 2 years ago. Private security license pulled once, reinstated later." She looked at me. "This is arson, no question. But if you're asking whether this ties directly to Martin Crowe, that's harder. We'll open a case, but you need to understand how this works." I nodded. I understood exactly how it worked. The people who give orders rarely leave fingerprints. By mid-morning, I was filing public records requests, HOA budgets, vendor contracts, meeting minutes, enforcement logs. I asked for receipts and date stamps and took photos of every form as it crossed the counter. I didn't trust paper alone. On the way back, my phone buzzed with notifications. Someone had posted a clip of the fire online, then another. The narrative was already forming without me. Controlled burn, safety issue, necessary enforcement. Lies move faster than truth when they wear official uniforms. That afternoon, I uploaded my own video. No commentary, no accusations, just timestamps and faces. I shared it publicly and sent the link to 3 journalists whose names Eleanor had whispered the night before. If the system could bury complaints, it couldn't bury mirrors held up to daylight. That night, the email arrived. No subject line, a burner address. "Stop digging or you'll lose more that supplies." I saved it, backed it up twice, and closed the laptop. Threats don't scare me, they clarify stakes. The next morning, I met with Deputy Mendel again, walked her through the email, the patrol patterns, the HOA notices. She listened carefully, then sighed. "You're poking a nest," she said, "but you're doing it the right way. Keep everything, don't confront anyone." I told her I had no intention of confronting anyone. Confrontation implies emotion. I was past that. 3 days passed in a rhythm of research and waiting. The HOA responded to my records request with a partial dump that raised more questions than it answered. There were summaries but no audits, vendor totals without invoices, and a reserve fund that made no sense for a community this size. Names repeated, addresses looped. I cross-referenced property transfers with violation spikes and watched a pattern take shape that was too neat to be coincidence. 11 homes sold under pressure, all bought by the same LLC, all preceded by escalating fines. The LLC traced back to a mailbox and a registered agent with ties to Martin Crowe's family. It was a machine built to squeeze until people broke, then harvest the breakage. Eleanor came by that evening, moving carefully, scanning the street before stepping onto my porch. I showed her the charts. She pressed her lips together and nodded. "They did this to the Harrisons," she said, "and the Becks, and old Mr. Patel." She swallowed. "They counted on us being alone." We sat in silence, listening to the wind. Before she left, she squeezed my hand. "You're not alone now." The patrol intensified after that. The white SUV idled across the street more often, sometimes with 2 men inside. One afternoon, they photographed my fence line from 3 angles. I waved. They didn't wave back. At midnight, they parked with lights off. I left my porch light on and my camera blinking. Psychological pressure is cheaper than paperwork. It's also sloppier. On the 5th night, the SUV lingered too long. A neighbor called it in suspicious. The irony tasted like metal. The lawsuit landed on a Monday. Defamation, harassment, emotional distress. Damages listed at $450,000. I read it once, then again, and laughed, a short, dry sound that surprised me. By trying to silence me, Crowe had opened discovery. Subpoenas cut through shadows. I spent that night learning civil procedure with the focus of the man who knows the terrain will decide the outcome. The next morning, I posted a single update with the lawsuit's first page visible, and nothing else. Public attention is a shield when wielded carefully. 2 days later, my phone rang, a blocked number. "This is Rachel Keene," a voice said. "I'm with a civil rights organization based in Helena. We've been watching your case." She had seen the footage. She'd pulled records. She believed the pattern was larger than Cedar Crest. We met 40 miles away in a diner that smelled like coffee and grease. She arrived with a folder thick enough to bend. HOA abuses across 3 counties. Same tactics, same shell companies, different faces. They're not unique, they're just sloppy. She slid a pro bono agreement across the table. "We'll countersue, and we'll use discovery to force daylight." I signed without hesitation. The dam cracked quickly.
The HOA's attorneys demanded my records, my posts, my history. Rachel answered with surgical requests of our own. 7 years of financials, all vendor contracts over $5,000, enforcement protocols, communications with security. The judge overseeing pre-trial motions had the patience of winter stone and little tolerance for games. Objections fell. Boxes arrived, 14 of them. We spread them across a rented conference room and worked for 3 days straight, building timelines and tracing flows. Money moved in circles, invoices billing for work no one remembered seeing, emergency repairs on buildings without emergencies, administrative fees to a Nevada box with no staff. Every thread led back to Crow and his relatives. Buried in emails, we found language that chilled me more than the fire had. Phase escalation, pressure sufficient, encourage voluntary sale, a spreadsheet with names and addresses, Eleanor's name near the bottom, mine added last. We weren't violators, we were inventory. That night, I took my grandfather's shotgun down from the wall and cleaned it out of habit, not intent. I set it on the table and opened my laptop. Violence would be a gift to men who needed me to become a caricature. Evidence would be the blade. Another email arrived, angrier this time. I archived it. Rachel called with news. The state had opened a preliminary inquiry into nonprofit fraud based on our filings. It'll take time, she warned. Don't give them an excuse. I agreed. The emergency HOA meeting notice hit mailboxes the next morning. Agenda vague, safety and standards. The attached resolution sought my expulsion and fast-tracked foreclosure authority. Desperation makes people move early. I made 2 calls. One to Deputy Mendel, updating her on the meeting and the documents. One to a reporter who had been waiting for a case like this. She promised cameras and a live feed. The night before the meeting, I slept in fragments, rehearsing facts instead of fears. At dawn, I dressed neatly and loaded the truck. I placed the shotgun by the door, then removed the shells and locked them away. Symbols matter, but restraint matters more. At the community center, chairs filled fast. Eleanor took the seat beside me. Others gathered, faces I recognized from whispered stories. The reporters set up in the back. When Crow entered, polished and confident, his eyes flicked to the shotgun across my lap and lingered a fraction too long. He called the meeting to order and demanded the weapon removed. A badge flashed from the back. Deputy Mendel's voice cut cleanly through the room. It's unloaded. Open carry is legal. The security men retreated. Crow's smile thinned. He read the resolution. I waited. When he finished, Eleanor stood and cited the bylaws. Due process. My turn. I rose, set the shotgun aside, and walked to the podium with my notebook. I spoke plainly. Timelines, videos, documents, faces on a screen. Gas poured, match struck, money routed, emails printed. The room shifted as certainty replaced rumor. Crow shouted. I held up the email with his instruction to handle the web situation. Metadata visible, IP logged. The silence afterward was absolute. Deputy Mendel stepped forward. Arrests followed. Not chaos, procedure. The truth has a sound when it lands. It's quieter than shouting and heavier than fear. As Crow was led away, I felt nothing like triumph, just the steady release of pressure. Outside, the sky was wide and cold. I went home and wrote everything down while it was fresh. The fight wasn't over, but it had turned.
Finding cracks, quiet at first and then impossible to stop. In the days after the meeting, Cedar Crest felt suspended in a strange half-life. Neighbors speaking in hushed tones, patrol vehicles conspicuously absent, the HOA office dark with its blinds drawn. News outlets ran the footage on repeat, freezing frames of gasoline arcing through the air, zooming in on jackets and faces, reading timestamps aloud like indictments. I spent those first 48 hours answering calls from Rachel, forwarding files to Deputy Mendel, and cataloging everything in my notebook so nothing blurred together. Precision mattered now more than ever. Martin Crow's arrest was only the opening move, not the endgame, and everyone involved knew it. His attorney tried to paint the fire as rogue behavior, an overzealous contractor acting alone, but the documents told a different story, one of direction and intent, and they kept telling it no matter how many times someone tried to interrupt. By the end of the week, the county announced formal charges: first-degree arson, conspiracy, and multiple counts of fraud. Crow was denied bail after the judge cited flight risk and witness intimidation, and that denial rippled through the community like a thunderclap. People who had avoided my eyes for months started nodding again. Some apologized without words, others with clumsy ones, all of them carrying the same realization that silence had been expensive. Derek Crow's name surfaced next, attached to shell companies and suspicious transfers, and when agents executed a warrant on Sunrise Holdings, the story widened beyond Cedar Crest. Boxes left offices, computers left desks, money froze mid-transfer. Travis Brunner flipped within days, trading testimony for leniency, detailing how phase escalation worked in practice, how patrols were used to unsettle, how violations were timed, how fire was chosen because it left fewer questions if framed as safety. His statements matched the emails and the spreadsheets so cleanly it was almost boring. That bored tone, the way facts aligned without drama, was what finally convinced the skeptics. Rachel moved quickly, filing a countersuit for malicious prosecution and civil rights violations, folding in affidavits from neighbors who would come forward once they realized they weren't alone. Eleanor testified first, her voice steady as she described fines arriving weeks after her husband's funeral, inspectors measuring the same fence 3 different ways, phone calls that went unanswered until a low offer appeared. James followed, then the Whitfields, then Margaret Chen, each story a variation on the same machinery, each name adding weight. The HOA's insurance carrier stepped in, hired its own investigators, and within a month announced it would not cover intentional criminal acts. The board members who hadn't been arrested resigned one by one, statements carefully worded and utterly hollow. An interim board formed under court supervision, its first action a moratorium on enforcement and a full audit. It felt less like victory and more like oxygen returning to a room that had been sealed too long. I rebuilt my routine while the legal process ground forward. Mornings started with coffee and notes, afternoons with calls and document reviews, evenings with quiet walks along Pine Road as the mountains turned purple. The camera still blinked red, but now it felt like a witness instead of a shield. One afternoon, a truck slowed in front of my place, and a man I barely recognized stepped out, hands shoved deep into his jacket. He introduced himself as the Harrisons' son and thanked me for finishing what his parents couldn't. He didn't stay long. Gratitude can be heavy, and neither of us wanted to carry it in public. The sheriff's department reassigned personnel and announced an internal review. Chief Miller from the next county was appointed to oversee the investigation. The phrase conflict of interest appeared in headlines so often it lost meaning, replaced by something more useful, accountability. When the indictments expanded to include Derek Crow and 2 former board members, the community center filled again, not with confrontation this time, but with people trying to understand what came next. Rachel spoke about restitution and reforms, about how HOAs could be dismantled or rebuilt, about checks and transparency. I stayed quiet, sitting near the back, listening. This wasn't my meeting to lead. It belonged to the people who had been managed for too long. A vote dissolved the old association charter and placed governance under a temporary council until new bylaws could be drafted. The sign at the office came down. Someone taped a piece of paper to the glass that read, "Closed for audit." It stayed there for weeks. The criminal trial moved faster than anyone expected. Evidence tends to do that. Emails don't forget, spreadsheets don't lie, and metadata is indifferent to charisma. When Crow took the stand against advice, his performance unraveled in minutes. He spoke about standards and values, about property values and order, and then the prosecutor put up the email with his directive and asked him to read it aloud. His voice wavered on the word handle. He tried to explain it away, but explanations are fragile things when the paper keeps staring back. The verdict came down after a single day of deliberation. Guilty on all major counts. Sentencing followed weeks later, 8 years. Restitution orders large enough to sting, but not large enough to erase what had been taken. Derek received 5. The security firm was dissolved, its assets seized, its license revoked statewide. Brunner entered a program that traded his testimony for a reduced sentence and mandatory bans. It wasn't perfect. Justice rarely is. It was sufficient. 6 months after the fire, I stood in my backyard watching a new shed frame rise, the lumber pale against the dark line of trees. Eleanor arrived with a loaf of bread still warm, set it on the railing without ceremony, and sat with me while we watched the sun slip behind the ridge. James sent seedlings from Billings, a note tucked inside the box that said simply, "For the next season." The new HOA council stopped by to confirm permits and asked if I wanted them to inspect the camera. I told them it worked. They smiled and moved on. Above the fireplace, the shotgun hung where it always had, cleaned, oiled, and untouched. I had carried it as a reminder of boundaries, then set it aside when words were enough. Some tools are meant to be present, not used. The last envelope arrived quietly, a settlement notice confirming funds set aside for those who had lost homes, timelines for claims, instructions written plainly. I placed it in the notebook and closed the cover. On the porch, a new sign faced the road, hand-painted by Eleanor in careful letters. This property protected by due process. It made people slow down. It made some smile. It made a few look away.
I watched snow begin to gather along the fence line and felt the steady calm of a winter prepared for honestly. The fight took months, but the lesson would last longer. Systems rely on fear until someone refuses to be afraid, and truth doesn't need volume when it has patience.
Winter arrived properly the week after sentencing, the kind of Montana cold that doesn't announce itself so much as settle in and refuse to leave. Snow packed hard along Pine Road, and the mountains wore a permanent white crown that made every sound feel smaller. With the criminal cases moving into appeals and paperwork, life in Cedar Crest shifted into a cautious reconstruction phase. The interim counsel held open forums twice a week, and for the first time since I'd moved here, people spoke without looking over their shoulders. I attended a few meetings, listened more than I talked, and left early when conversations drifted toward praise. I didn't want to be anyone's symbol. Symbols invite replacement, systems need repair. Rachel stayed busy, coordinating civil claims and navigating the slow grind of restitution. The numbers mattered, who owed what, who qualified, how funds would be distributed, but so did the order. Done wrong, it would fracture the fragile trust that had finally begun to form. Done right, it would feel like a reset, not a punishment. The appeals brief arrived from Crow's attorneys thick with familiar language, procedural errors, prejudicial publicity, overreach. Rachel dismantled it piece by piece, pointing to transcripts, rulings, and the mountain of evidence that had been admitted without objection. The appellate court denied the emergency stay in a single page. Momentum is a real thing when it turns. The same outlets that once amplified the HOA's statements now printed corrections and timelines, their tone sober, almost embarrassed. A long-form investigation ran statewide, tracing the pattern across counties and naming names that hadn't appeared in months. It quoted Eleanor and James and Margaret, not me. That was deliberate. Movements outgrow in sparks or they burn out. On a quiet Thursday, Deputy Mendel stopped by with a clipboard and a thermos. We stood on the porch while she reviewed a few follow-up questions, mostly confirmations, nothing dramatic. Before leaving, she paused. "You did good work," she said. "Most people don't." Compliments make me uneasy, but I thanked her. When she drove off, I noticed the street felt different. No idling engines, no slow passes, just the wind and a raven picking at something frozen near the ditch. Peace, the real kind, has texture. The rebuild of my shed finished before the deepest cold set in. I stacked firewood in clean rows, measured twice, labeled everything. Old habits die hard. The new water barrels lined the wall, and the smoked meat hung wrapped and sealed. Preparation isn't paranoia when winter kills quietly. Eleanor brought soup one evening and stayed long enough to watch the stars come out, bright and sharp. She told me she joined the council's advisory group, laughed at the idea, then shrugged. "Someone has to remember what it was like," she said. "Otherwise people forget too quickly." She was right. Forgetting is convenient. Rachel called late one night with news that surprised me. The insurance pool had agreed to fund additional settlements beyond the initial list, acknowledging failures in oversight. It wouldn't bring back lost homes, but it would stabilize lives. "It's not justice," she said. "It's math. Math can be merciful when wielded carefully." The next morning, the interim council announced a vote to dissolve the HOA permanently and transition to a voluntary neighborhood association with limited scope and transparent finances. The vote passed overwhelmingly. Applause filled the room, then quiet. No speeches, no slogans, just a sense of something ending cleanly. I found myself thinking about Kandahar more often than I expected, not because of the danger, but because of the waiting, the long stretches where nothing happened and you learned to trust process and preparation. The fight here had been different, but the rhythm was familiar. Watch, record, verify, act when the moment mattered. People asked if I'd write about it, speak about it, take calls. I declined. Attention is a tool, not a home. I'd used it when necessary and set it down when it became noise. One afternoon, a moving truck stopped 2 houses down. A young couple unloaded boxes, glancing around with that mix of hope and worry new places inspire. I walked over and introduced myself, offered help. We carried a couch together and talked about the view, the winters, the quiet. I didn't mention fires or lawsuits or arrests. Those things don't belong in first impressions. They'll learn the rest organically through minutes from meetings and the absence of patrols and the sign on my porch. Safety doesn't need an introduction. The appellate decision came down in early spring, concise and final. Convictions upheld, sentences upheld. The opinion read like a checklist of failed arguments and solid rulings. Rachel forwarded it with a single line, closed. I printed it, filed it, and went back to stacking wood that didn't need stacking yet. Ritual matters. Closure isn't an event, it's maintenance. At the community center, the new association hosted a potluck to mark the transition. Tables bowed with casseroles and pies. Kids ran between chairs, and laughter rose where whispers once lived. I stood near the door with Eleanor and James's daughter, who'd driven in for the occasion. Someone tapped a glass and thanked everyone who
stood up. I felt eyes turn and stepped outside before they settled. The night was cool, the sky wide. I listened to the muffled sounds through the wall and felt content to be adjacent rather than central. Later, back home, I took down the shotgun and cleaned it again, slow and thorough, then hung it back. Tools should be cared for whether they're used or not. I checked the camera feed out of habit and smiled at the blinking red light, now an open secret. Transparency changes behavior more effectively than threats. On my desk, the notebook lay closed, thick with dates and arrows and notes that had served their purpose. I didn't burn it. Erasing records invites repetition. I placed it on a shelf within reach. Spring pushed through stubborn snow in fits and starts. The seedlings James sent took hold, green against brown. Eleanor's roses returned cautiously, trimmed but alive. The road crews fixed a pothole that had been ignored for years. Small things accumulate. One morning, I noticed the old HOA office had been leased to a co-op, its windows clear, its door propped open. People went in and out without glancing at the street. That felt like a win. I stood on the porch at desk, watching clouds catch fire and fade, thinking about the first morning I'd stood in ashes and the long line of choices since, none of them heroic, just consistent, refusing shortcuts, refusing fear, letting paper and patience do their work. The sign on the railing had weathered slightly, paint dulled by sun and snow, but the words remained legible. I touched the wood once, then went inside as the temperature dropped. Winter would come again. I was ready.
Spring didn't erase what had happened. It reorganized it. The snow retreated in uneven patches, revealing ground that looked older than it had in years, scarred and honest. With the HOA dissolved and the legal machinery winding down, Cedar Crest entered a phase that felt unfamiliar, normalcy without supervision. It turned out people didn't need constant notices to maintain their homes. Lawns got mowed, fences got fixed, problems got handled with conversations instead of fines. The absence of enforcement noise made room for something else, something quieter and harder to name. Trust takes time, and time had been stolen here. It would have to be repaid slowly. Rachel shifted her focus to final settlements and compliance oversight, checking that restitution checks went where they were supposed to go and that liens were released correctly. Paper errors can do real harm if left unattended, and she treated each one like a loose thread worth pulling. I helped where I could, organizing files, confirming dates, making myself useful without being central. The spotlight had a way of drifting back, and I stepped sideways when it did. The work mattered more than the story about the work. Eleanor threw herself into the advisory group with a precision that surprised no one who had ever sat in her classroom decades earlier. She remembered names, dates, and promises with a clarity that made meetings shorter and outcomes cleaner. When someone suggested letting bygones be bygones, she leaned forward and asked which bygones and for whom. The question landed. Burying the past without accounting for it was how it grew roots. She wasn't interested in roots. The civil case closed with signatures instead of headlines. Funds moved, accounts settled. A few defendants negotiated quietly to avoid further exposure. Others fought until the math stopped favoring them. Through it all, the community learned how to read documents, how to ask for receipts, how to attend meetings with agendas instead of assumptions. Those skills outlast any verdict. They're portable. I kept my routines tight. Mornings started early, afternoons stayed flexible, evenings were for walking the perimeter and listening. The camera continued to blink, now disclosed and accepted. Transparency is a disinfectant when it's applied evenly. One evening, as I adjusted a fence post, a man from 2 streets over stopped talk. He'd been fined years earlier for a mailbox that leaned after a storm. He hadn't challenged it. He hadn't thought he could. He thanked me awkwardly and left before the gratitude grew heavy. I understood. Not everything needs an answer. The interim council completed its final report and disbanded, replaced by a volunteer association with capped authority and published ledgers. The bylaws fit on a few pages and read like common sense. No fines without votes, no contracts without bids, no enforcement without appeal. It wasn't revolutionary, it was boring. Boring is sustainable. I thought about my grandfather often during those months, not as a presence, but as a pattern. He'd taught me that preparation wasn't fear, that patience wasn't weakness, and that standing your ground didn't always look like standing tall. Sometimes it looked like sitting down with a notebook and refusing to be rushed. I'd carried his shotgun into a room to draw a line, and then stepped away from it when words could do the job. That balance mattered. The county released a public report outlining failures in oversight and recommending changes to how private associations interfaced with public services. Training requirements tightened, reporting channels clarified. It was the kind of document few people read and many people benefited from. That was fine. Quiet fixes age better than loud victories. One afternoon, I drove out to the ridge where the road bends and the valley opens wide. The air smelled like wet pine and thawing earth. From up there, Cedar Crest looked small, a scattering of roofs and trees stitched together by roads that led elsewhere. Problems always look smaller from a distance. Solutions do too. Perspective doesn't solve anything, but it helps you choose which battles deserve your time. The reporter who had live-streamed the meeting sent a final message asking for a retrospective interview. I declined politely and suggested she talk to Eleanor and James's daughter instead. Stories shouldn't orbit one person when they belong to many. She understood. Her follow-up piece focused on reforms, not faces. Summer crept in, tentative at first, then confident. The seedlings grew, the roses bloomed cautiously, then all at once. Children rode bikes without dodging patrols. The old HOA office, now a co-op, hosted a workshop on budgeting and transparency that filled its small room. I attended, sat in the back, took notes. Skills compound when shared. One evening, a thunderstorm rolled through without warning, rain hammering the roof and lightning cracking close enough to rattle windows. I stood on the porch watching water run off the eaves and thought about fire and water and the strange symmetry of loss and repair. The shed held, the barrels were full, the lights stayed on. Preparedness works quietly. Rachel called with a final update. All compliance boxes checked, all appeals exhausted, all settlements delivered. You can close the file, she said. I thanked her and meant more than the words carried. Partnerships built under pressure tend to be honest. We said goodbye without ceremony. I took the notebook down from the shelf that night and flipped through it once, slowly. Names, arrows, dates. The handwriting shifted where stress had tightened my grip. I added one last entry at the end, nothing dramatic, just a date and a note that the matter was resolved. Then I closed it and put it back. Records don't need endings, they need storage. At dusk, I replaced the porch sign's screws, tightening them against a summer breeze. The paint had faded slightly, but the message still read clean. Cars slowed, some waved. I waved back. Community is a verb, not a noun. You do it repeatedly, or you lose it. When the first hints of autumn returned, I stacked wood again, not because I had to, but because it felt right. Winter would come whether I worried or not. I preferred readiness without drama. As the light thinned, I sat on the steps and listened to the wind move through trees that had stood longer than any association. Time has a way of sorting things out when people stop trying to own it. Inside, the house settled. The camera blinked. The shotgun stayed on the wall. Outside, the road lay quiet and open. I felt the rare satisfaction of a conflict concluded without becoming something I couldn't undo. That mattered. By the time autumn settled back over Cedar Crest, the sharpness of the crisis had dulled into something steadier, a memory with edges sanded down by repetition and routine. Leaves turned in layers, gold over rust, over brown, and the mountains resumed their quiet watch, indifferent to human corrections. I kept busy in small, deliberate ways, fixing a hinge here, repainting trim there, the kind of maintenance that reminds you a place is lived in rather than controlled. The Volunteer Association met monthly and published minutes within a day, boring documents filled with votes about snow removal schedules and shared tools. Boring was the point. I attended when I could, spoke when asked, and declined invitations to chair anything. Leadership attracts gravity, and gravity bends things. I preferred to stay level. Eleanor thrived in the new rhythm, her presence both firm and gentle, the kind of authority that came from memory rather than power. When disagreements surfaced, she asked for sources and timelines, and the room complied. The habit of evidence had taken hold. The civil aftershocks continued quietly. A few former board members reached out through attorneys, offering apologies packaged with explanations. I read them and filed them. Closure doesn't require forgiveness. It requires clarity. Rachel checked in once more to confirm that all restitution checks had cleared and that lien releases had been recorded properly. She sounded satisfied, which for her meant the numbers matched reality. We spoke briefly about next steps for the broader reforms, how other communities were adapting the transparency template Cedar Crest had piloted. She said my name had come up at a conference, paired with words like precedent and model. I told her to correct them if she could. Models should be reproducible without a spark. One afternoon, a pickup slowed near my driveway and stopped. A man stepped out holding a folded flyer. He introduced himself as part of a county task force on nonprofit oversight and asked if I'd consider reviewing a draft checklist for HOA compliance. He'd been directed to me by 3 different people who didn't know each other. I scanned the list, marked a few lines, and handed it back with suggestions written in pencil. Clear definitions, independent audits, cooling off periods for enforcement actions. Simple things that change outcomes. He thanked me and drove off. I went back to stacking wood. Influence, like heat, works best when it's distributed.
The camera blinked as it always had, now mentioned in the association's welcome packet as an example of optional transparency. New residents arrived and settled without incident. A family with a dog moved into the house that had sat empty since the Harrisons left. They planted a tree in the spring and invited neighbors to help. People showed up. That felt like a victory you couldn't count. Winter arrived early that year. The first heavy snow fell before Thanksgiving, blanketing Pine Road and muting sound to a hush. I woke before dawn and watched flakes slide past the window, then checked the shed out of habit. Everything held. Preparation is a conversation with the future that doesn't require optimism. Eleanor called to say she'd baked too much and would trade soup for firewood. We laughed and did exactly that. Barter builds trust faster than policy. As the days shortened, the past returned in smaller ways. A comment at the store. A look held a beat too long. Not everyone had processed what happened at the same speed. Some people prefer neat stories, with heroes and villains and endings. Reality is messier. I reminded myself that discomfort was part of adjustment, not a signal to intervene. Systems settle when allowed to. In January, the appellate court released its final order denying all remaining motions. It was anticlimactic in the best way. I printed it, added it to the file, and closed the folder for good. That night, I cleaned the shotgun again, not because it needed it, but because ritual steadies the mind. I checked the safety and hung it back on the wall. Tools have places. Knowing when to put them down is as important as knowing when to pick them up. The Volunteer Association announced a winter project to document shared resources and skills. Who had a plow? Who knew electrical work? Who could watch kids in a storm? The list grew quickly. I added my name next to logistics and documentation. Labels are fined when they're chosen. During a blizzard that shut the highway for a day, the list paid off. Food moved, driveways cleared, no notices issued, no fines assessed, just coordination. In February, a letter arrived from a law school clinic asking if I'd speak to students about evidence collection and public records. I declined the lecture and offered to share anonymized templates instead. They accepted. The templates circulated. That felt right. Knowledge wants to be useful. March brought thaw and mud and a sense of release. I drove out to the ridge again, watched runoff carve paths through snowbanks, and thought about how pressure finds exits. The valley looked resilient, patched, and imperfect. I returned home and helped Eleanor prune her roses, careful cuts that promised more later. She told me she planned to step back from the advisory group after the year. Someone else should learn, she said. That's how this sticks. I nodded. Stewardship is temporary by design. A new sign appeared at the community center listing meeting dates and posting contact information for county oversight. It was laminated, unremarkable, and exactly the kind of thing that would have been contested before. Now it was just there. People used it. The co-op expanded its hours. The workshop schedule filled. A local paper ran a piece on civic habits with Cedar Crest as an example. No names, just practices. By late spring, the ground had warmed enough for planting. I put in a small garden beside the shed. Nothing ambitious. Rows aligned, soil amended, seeds pressed in with care. Growth is patient. While watering, I caught myself scanning the tree line out of old habit and smiled at the reflex. Habits fade slowly when they're no longer fed. The anniversary of the fire went by without ceremony. I noticed it only because the date appeared on a receipt. I stood in the shed for a moment, listened to the wind, and left it at that. Memorials can be private. One evening, a young man knocked on my door and introduced himself as a reporter's intern working on a follow-up about reforms. He asked what I'd learned. I thought for a second and told him to write that systems fail when they operate without receipts and succeed when they publish them. He wrote it down, thanked me, and left. Simple sentences travel well. As summer returned, Cedar Crest felt ordinary again. Ordinary is earned. I walked the road at dusk, waved at neighbors, and watched the sky darken. The porch sign remained, weathered but legible. Inside, the house settled. Outside, the night opened. I felt no urge to add chapters or seek conclusions. The work had become maintenance, and maintenance is the quiet proof that something survived.
Summer deepened and then slowly tipped toward its edge, the days stretching long and warm before surrendering minutes back to night, and Cedar Crest settled into a rhythm that felt earned rather than imposed. The Volunteer Association functioned without drama, agendas posted, minutes shared, disagreements handled in plain language that left little room for misinterpretation. I found myself thinking less about what had happened and more about what didn't happen anymore. The patrols that never came back, the letters that stopped arriving, the subtle tension that had drained from conversations at the store. Absence can be as instructive as presence if you pay attention to it. I kept paying attention, not out of fear, but out of habit, the kind that keeps systems honest by refusing to look away. Rachel checked in periodically, mostly to share how other communities were adapting the templates and checklists we'd built. A town 2 counties over dissolved its HOA after an audit revealed similar vulnerabilities, though nothing as severe. Another adopted term limits and independent oversight. Small changes multiplied quietly, not because anyone was chasing credit, but because the alternatives had been exposed. She mentioned that the state legislature was considering a bill to standardize disclosures for private associations. I didn't follow the details closely. Laws matter, but culture does the daily work. If people expect receipts, they tend to get them. Eleanor stepped back from her advisory role in late July, exactly as she'd said she would, handing her binder to a younger neighbor who listened carefully and asked good questions. On her last evening in the role, we sat on her porch and watched the sun sink behind the ridge, the light turning everything soft. I didn't do anything special, she said, as if anticipating a compliment. I just remembered. Memory, I'd learned, was a form of resistance. Forgetting made abuses portable. The house 2 doors down hosted a block dinner in August, folding tables lining the street, kids chalking hopscotch squares, adults trading recipes and stories that didn't orbit conflict. I brought bread and left early, content to have shown up. Community doesn't need constant attendance, it needs reliability. I noticed the camera blinking and felt a brief, familiar tightening in my chest before it passed. Transparency had normalized itself. That was the goal all along. A letter arrived from the county clerk confirming the final lien releases and the closure of outstanding cases. It was bureaucratic and dry, the kind of document that would have felt meaningless months earlier. Now it read like a quiet exhale. I filed it with the others and moved on to stacking wood for the coming winter, not because the forecast demanded it yet, but because readiness feels different when it's chosen rather than coerced. The shed stood solid, its lines clean, its contents orderly. Preparation had returned to its rightful place as prudence instead of defiance. The first frost came early, painting the grass silver and sharpening the air. I walked Pine Road at dawn and counted familiar details, the way light hit the mailbox, the sound of gravel under boots, the raven that seemed to follow me for a quarter mile before lifting off. Nothing felt surveilled, everything felt observed in the simple way neighbors observed one another, aware and unthreatened. That distinction matters more than people realize. In September, the co-op hosted a workshop on records requests and basic accounting, and the room filled beyond capacity. I sat in the back and listened as residents learned how to read balance sheets and spot inconsistencies, how to ask questions without accusation, how to document interactions calmly. Education is a preventative measure. It doesn't stop bad actors from existing, but it narrows their room to operate. Watching the room, I felt a cautious satisfaction that had nothing to do with vindication. A small moment tested that calm. A contractor hired by the association missed a deadline and sent an invoice anyway. The chair asked for clarification. The contractor bristled, implied urgency. The association asked for documentation and proposed a revised schedule. The contractor complied. No shouting, no threats, just process. It was almost boring, almost perfect. As the anniversary of the meeting approached, a reporter emailed asking for reflection. I declined again, but this time offered a sentence she could print without attribution. Sustainable communities rely on habits, not heroes. She used it. That was enough. I spent an afternoon reviewing my notebook one last time, not to relive it, but to ensure the record was complete. I added a brief addendum noting the final outcomes, and then sealed it in a box with other important papers. Archival instincts die hard. Records keep their own counsel, waiting for the day they're needed again. I hoped they wouldn't be. October arrived with clear skies and brittle leaves. I helped Eleanor rake her yard, the work companionable and unhurried. She told me she'd been sleeping better. Quiet helps, she said. So does knowing where to look if it doesn't last. She meant the minutes, the contacts, the posted schedules. Knowing where to look changes how people feel about power. The Volunteer Association planned a winter preparedness day, coordinating plows, generators, and check-ins for older residents. The list filled quickly. I signed up for logistics and documentation again, comfortable in roles that emphasized follow-through. On the day of the event, the community center buzzed with activity. Maps spread across tables, names matched to resources. The system worked because it was simple and shared. One evening, near the end of the month, a young couple knocked on my door with a question about property lines. They'd heard conflicting advice and wanted clarity before building a fence. We pulled up the county map, checked measurements, and resolved it in 10 minutes. They thanked me and left smiling. It struck me how small conflicts can be when addressed early and openly. Delay inflates everything. As nights grew longer, I found myself less vigilant without trying. Habits softened into routines that didn't carry edge. I still noticed details, but they no longer demanded interpretation. The porch sign remained, its paint weathered but intact, less a warning than a reminder. Cars slowed, some waved. I waved back. On the last warm evening before the cold set in for good, I sat on the steps and watched the sky dim, thinking about how the fight had shifted from exposure to maintenance, from urgency to care. Winning hadn't meant domination or applause. It meant restoring ordinary processes and then getting out of their way. That kind of outcome doesn't photograph well, but it lasts. Inside, the house settled with familiar sounds. The camera blinked, the shotgun stayed on the wall. Outside, the road lay open, and the mountains held their line against the dark.
I felt the quiet satisfaction of knowing that if trouble ever returned, it would find a place prepared to meet it without panic, with records and receipts, and neighbors who knew how to stand together. That knowledge, more than any verdict, was the real inheritance of what we'd done.
The first real snow of the season fell overnight, light and steady, turning Cedar Crest into a quiet map of softened edges by morning. I woke before dawn out of habit, brewed coffee, and stood at the window, watching flakes drift past the porch light. Nothing felt tense anymore. The stillness wasn't waiting for something to happen. It simply existed. That difference mattered. I pulled on boots and stepped outside, the cold sharp enough to wake every sense, and walked the length of Pine Road while the world was still asleep. Footprints from yesterday were gone, erased clean, and for a moment it felt like starting over without erasing memory. When I reached the end of the road and turned back, I noticed how ordinary everything looked, and how extraordinary that ordinariness had become. By mid-morning, the neighborhood stirred. A plow moved through once, clean and efficient, and disappeared without ceremony. No citations, no warnings, just work done and left behind. I spent the day in the shed, organizing shelves, checking seals, stacking wood with the quiet satisfaction of order maintained. Preparation had returned to its proper scale, neither defiant nor hidden, simply practical. I thought about the first winter here, the blackout, the cold that bargained with you, and how fear had shaped decisions then. Now there was no fear attached to readiness. That felt like progress. In the afternoon, Eleanor stopped by with a tin of cookies and a folded note she'd written the night before. It wasn't a thank you. It was a reminder, in her careful handwriting, of meeting dates, contacts, and where records were kept. "For when I forget," she said with a small smile. I tucked it into a folder on the desk. Systems don't survive on gratitude. They survive on continuity. We talked about nothing urgent, about weather and recipes and the way the mountains look sharper after snow. When she left, she waved without checking the street first. I noticed that too. As the day faded, I checked messages out of routine. One was from Rachel, brief and final, confirming that all files had been archived and that the case was formally closed at every level. No loose ends, no pending actions. "You did what needed doing," she wrote. "The rest is upkeep." I replied with thanks and closed the thread. Some conversations are meant to end cleanly. The Volunteer Association sent out a winter checklist that evening, practical and unremarkable. I skimmed it, nodded, and set it aside. The habits were in place. People knew what to do. That was the point where leadership steps back and lets structure hold. I'd seen the opposite too many times, when someone clung to relevance and bent systems around themselves. Letting go is part of building. After dark, I took the shotgun down one last time that season, checked it, wiped it, and returned it to its place above the fireplace. It hadn't fired a single round through all of this. Its value had been symbolic, a boundary rather than a solution. I was glad of that. Violence leaves a residue that paperwork does not. I turned off the lights and let the house settle, the familiar creaks and sighs of wood adjusting to cold. The next morning, the anniversary of the fire arrived quietly. No alerts, no messages, just a date on the calendar that I noticed while flipping pages. I stood in the shed for a minute, hands in pockets, and listened. Nothing burned, nothing threatened. The past stayed where it belonged, documented and contained. I closed the door and went back inside. Over the following days, small confirmations accumulated. A neighbor resolved a fence question with a quick call to the county map office. Another posted meeting minutes the same night instead of the next week. The co-op announced a new transparency workshop and filled the room again. None of it made headlines. None of it needed to. This was what success looked like when it wasn't trying to impress anyone. One evening, as snow began to fall again, I stood on the porch and looked at the sign on the railing. The paint had dulled, the edges worn smooth by weather and time, but the words still read clearly. They didn't feel confrontational anymore. They felt factual. Due process isn't a threat. It's a promise that power will move slowly enough to be seen. I tightened one screw and left the others alone. Somewhere is honest. I thought about the people who had left Cedar Crest before the reckoning, the houses that had changed hands under pressure, the gardens abandoned. Not everything could be restored. Loss doesn't reverse simply because wrongdoing is named. But the conditions that produced the losses had been dismantled, and that mattered. Future harm had been interrupted. Sometimes that's the most you can do, and sometimes it's enough. As winter deepened, life settled into patterns that didn't require commentary. Wood burned clean, water stayed unfrozen, roads cleared, neighbors checked on neighbors without being told. The camera continued to blink, an accepted presence, a quiet witness in a place that no longer pretended not to see. I stopped checking the feed daily, and then stopped noticing that I'd stopped. Habits change when the reason for them disappears. One night, lying awake while the wind moved through trees older than any dispute, I understood something I hadn't been able to name before. The real victory hadn't been the arrests or the verdicts or the settlements. It had been the refusal to become what the system expected in order to defeat it. Patience over spectacle.
Records over rage, process over impulse. That choice had shaped everything that followed. Morning came clear and cold. I made coffee, pulled on boots, and stepped outside. The road lay open. The mountains held steady. There was nothing left to prove. Maintenance would continue, quietly, shared by many hands. I felt the simple, grounded certainty of a place that had learned how to look after itself without fear. That was the ending. Not a crescendo, but a steady note held long enough to become normal again.